This story grips our imagination. At least as a boy, it sure gripped mine. I remember some of the translations, the main translations called David a boy. And I was a boy. And David did battle using a slingshot. And I had a slingshot. But this story can also trouble us because there are some gruesome aspects. Um, this is basically an R-rated movie, you might say, R for violence. Particularly that image of David holding Goliath's severed head up high. Interestingly, it didn't trouble me as a child. I grew up knowing from my church and from my parents that Jesus wanted us to love people, not to kill people. But David killing the enemy and severing his head with his own sword was heroic, was faithful. We celebrated this boy named David with only a little sling who made the giant come tumbling down. I remember the first time that I felt some squeamishness about this story was I was probably in my 30s or 40s, and I was preparing to preach this story. And I had 4 young children, and I thought, wow, this is a bloody story. Do I want my children picturing David, a hero, doing this? I think it's similar to what happens when we today read Grimm's fairy tales in the original versions. And we think, people read this to their children? Those tales were written for children, but sensibilities have changed. So the modern versions, as we read them to our children now, are likely revised and tamed. But we can do that for Grimm's, but we can't do that for Scripture. We didn't want Sam to read about this giant saying all kinds of nasty and mean things, and so David just knocks him out on the head, gives him a little enforced timeout. And then when Goliath comes to, David walks over to him and says, hey, why can't we be friends, or at least good neighbors? We can't change Scripture like that, can we? So what do we do with this story about all of its killing? And further, it's not just our cultural sensibilities that are changing here. It's us changing because Jesus told us to. Jesus has told us how God's people are to act toward our enemies. We are to love them. We are to pray for them. We are to do good to them, bless them. And here is a main Old Testament hero who is not acting that way. So it can seem that this is not a good story. But this is a good story, even where it's not good. Let me unpack that a little bit. So Sam read just some of 1 Samuel 17. Let's work our way through that chapter, starting at verse 1, catching what's going on, enjoying it as a story, feasting on and celebrating on the good in this story, and maybe even seeing the good in what seems not good. So, verse 1 describes the Philistines mustering their army for battle. So, they were coming up along the coast, up one of the valleys toward Israel. And the end of verse 1, it says, there they set up camp. And verse 2, Saul, who is the king of Israel, he countered by gathering his troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and the Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with the valley where this little river of Elah ran through. So they were the two main people groups in Canaan. And here they were in the middle of Canaan, meeting for battle, fighting for dominance. Verse 4, then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. And this was quite an opponent for Israel. Let me read from the New Living Translation. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet. His bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor bearer walked ahead of him carrying a shield. Interestingly, the biblical authors seldom give physical descriptions. That's just the way that they are. This is like the longest physical description in the Hebrew Bible. They seldom give long descriptions unless it is very important to the story. So, there's something very important here. Let's sort of unpack it. To get a sense of this giant's size, imagine Shaq, the basketball player, standing by me. He's like a foot taller than me. You picture Shaq standing by me. I would not want to fight a guy that's a foot taller than me. Well, now imagine a guy not just a foot taller than me, but 2 feet taller than Shaq yet. And then imagine me shorter, because people in that day were shorter than me. But the narrator spends more time on Goliath's armament. His metal coat weighs 125 pounds. The point of his spear was 15 pounds. Think of the weight of a heavy bowling ball on the end of a spear. Huge, because Goliath was huge. The Philistine strategy is to let Goliath intimidate Israel into submission. End of verse 8, Goliath is shouting to the Israelites, choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we will be your slaves. But if I kill him, you will be our slaves. When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. For 40 days, every morning and evening, that's what happened. Goliath would come out and issue this challenge. Then David comes on the scene. David's family was from Bethlehem, which was maybe 14 miles from the battle lines. The end of verse 14, David's 3 oldest brothers stayed with Saul's army, but David went back and forth. so he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem. One day, this is verse 17, Jesse said to David, "Take this basket of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers and bring back a report of how they are doing." The middle of verse 23, right when David got there, it says, Goliath came out. David heard him shout his usual taunt. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. "Have you seen the giant?" the men asked. "He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him." Verse 26, David asked the soldiers standing nearby, "What will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" Notice David's change in language. Everyone else is terrified because, the middle of verse 25, they see Goliath as defying Israel. Goliath is coming after them. But David sees him defying, the end of verse 36, the end of verse 26, and then he repeats it, the end of verse 36 and the end of verse 45. Goliath is defying not Israel, but the armies of the living God. So we're looking, is this story bad or good? Well, isn't that good, what David just did there? Instead of Goliath coming after them, Goliath is coming after God, which won't work that well for Goliath. Verse 28, but when David's oldest brother, Eliab, heard David talking to the men, he was angry. "What are you doing around here anyway?" he demanded. "What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle." If you remember from the last sermon on David, looking at 1 Samuel 16, David's family does not value him very much. As we saw the last time, they sent him off to do menial tasks. And when there was honor that was going to be given, they didn't even think to have him be there in the mix. "What have I done now?" David replied. "I was only asking a question." Isn't that good? The family is trying to put David down, but David didn't let this older brother beat him down. Verse 30, David walked over to some others and asked them the same thing and received the same answer. Then David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. "Don't worry about this Philistine," David told Saul. "I will go fight him." 37, "The Lord has rescued me from the claws of the lion and a bear. He will rescue me from this Philistine." This is good on so many levels. Rather than being immobilized by the put-downs from his family, David sees what he can do. The Lord has helped him with a bear and a lion. David drew confidence from those past victories. That's good. The end of verse 37, Saul finally consented. "All right, go ahead," he said, "and may the Lord be with you." So now Israel has a champion to counter Goliath. But Saul's not done here trying to help. He offered to let David use his own armor, the king's armor, which would have been really flattering for David to be able to wear the king's armor. But David wasn't after easy honor or status. David was after effectiveness. He hadn't won past victories using armor, depending on that, but on his sling. So he said no to the king's offer of immediate status. Again, isn't this good? Verse 40, he picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them into his shepherd's bag. Then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Many of you know, but David's sling was a piece of leather, sort of a little pocket of leather, with long cords attached to both ends of that leather. You fold the stone in the leather, you grab the cords, the end of the cords, you whirl it around your head, let go of one of the cords at just the right moment, and the stone goes sailing. Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote a book entitled David and Goliath, said, the stone that came from the sling had the stopping power of a bullet from a .45 caliber pistol. And the Bible talks about these men, I think they were from the tribe of Benjamin, who could sling a stone at a hair's breadth. I forget from how great a distance, but they practiced a lot. They were amazingly accurate. Goliath came out to meet him. Verse 42, sneering in contempt at this rosy-cheeked boy. Am I a dog, he roared at David, that you come at me with a stick? Come over here and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals. And David responds. This is sort of like boxers weighing in and they're taunting each other. Verse 45, you come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Do you notice David's weapon? Is it, I'm coming to you with my version of the Colt 45? No, I'm coming in the name of the Lord. The hero here is not me and my weapons. The hero here is God. 46, today the Lord will conquer you, and I will kill you and cut off your head. And then I will give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. David is portraying God as the hero, not himself as the hero. That's good. Then comes the killing. Verse 48, as Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. Again, that's good. David took the initiative rather than letting the giant control the situation. Reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. It talked about all the armor he had on all his body, but there evidently was no armor there. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone. Then is the head-severing part. Then the Philistines turn and run, and the men of Israel give a great shout and rush after them. And the violence and killing continue. The next sentence, verse 52, their dead were strewn along the road to Gath and Ekron, two of the great cities of the Philistines. Story definitely rated R for violence. David said, God is the one who helped Israel kill them. Verse 47, this is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. Yet that sounds different than the God Jesus taught us about, who sends rain on the just and the unjust, who loved the whole world so much that he gave his only begotten Son, who died that they might be saved. But even here, in this very spot, this troubling spot, we can see good. I'll pull out one great good. God definitely wanted Israel to act as Jesus was going to call them to act. But Israel was not there yet. David and all Israel in that bloody and brutal time could not imagine, let alone pursue, any other way than killing their enemies. They couldn't imagine, let alone practice, loving those who were coming to crush them. Just as we still, 2,000 years after we as a church have been chewing on Jesus' words, trying to let it sink deep in and change the way that we act, we have a hard time imagining and practicing that too. But here's the great good. Even as Israel falls so far short of Jesus, God is not ashamed to be called their God. God had chosen Israel as his partners. He was going to work in the world through them. And God doesn't turn his back on them, even though they are way below his ideal, which becomes known through the way and the teaching of Jesus. God doesn't wash his hands of them, but he keeps relating to them. Even though their brutality, their sin sullies him. One day, some highly cultured and civilized people will point to this story and they will disdain the Old Testament God. They will disdain how primitive and barbaric that God is. But God does not give up on his people. God does not stop relating to them, even though it sullies him. God stoops down to the level of what his human partners can freely do, and he meets them where they are. Isn't that amazingly good? And God does not, as he stoops to meet them there and interact with them there, he does not leave them there. He patiently keeps giving nudges toward the ultimate ethic toward which he wants them to move. God gives hints as they are able to hear. He sows seeds. For instance, in several weeks we're going to look at this. He doesn't let David build the temple. David wanted to build a temple, a house for God, and the prophet Nathan said, yeah, you should do that. And then the Lord spoke to the prophet, and the prophet spoke to David and walked that back. And he said that David had shed much blood on the earth in God's sight. And so he was not to build the temple, but David's son, a man of peace, was to build it. 1 Chronicles 22. God slowly and patiently was moving them toward the ethic of David's greater son, of Jesus, who was a descendant of David. This is amazingly good, what God is doing in this story. And not just this particular episode, but his story of relating to his people. May we always read the Old Testament with this attitude. I know some people read the Old Testament and they say, my, look at how barbaric, brutal, bloody that time was, what God's people did. But may we, as we read it, not dwell on the sub-gospel instances, frustrated at people being way below the example of Jesus, but may we be looking for the good, the beautiful instances of someone's faith and trust in God, helping them rise higher than those around them. Like David not being terrified because he didn't see Goliath defying Israel, but he saw him defying God. And David not boasting in his weapons, like his weapons were the key here, but boasting in his God. And not only looking for those instances of where the Spirit of God changed people, lifted them from those around them, higher ethically from those around them, but also be on a hunt as you read the Old Testament for those beautiful glimpses of God nudging his people toward the life that Jesus was one day going to fully show everyone. So, yes, there is much good in this story that we've been feasting on this morning, even where it's not good. David and definitely God are doing a lot of things right in this story.